exceptions that people come to me about is they'll say, well, what do you think of so-and-so? And it doesn't matter who so-and-so is. They've always got someone, where Dan Errol the other day tweeted that I should be able to hit this person with a bat until they're dead. And Dan Errol knows that I love to use him as my go-to example, but there are bad actors, and I'm not necessarily calling Dan a bad actor, but there are bad actors within every community. There are people who I disagree with within every community. But there are a lot of ideas within social justice that when you know what they mean, people instantly go, oh, I'm not against that. The example, I know you've heard me use this before, but the example I use all the time is a safe space, right? It's impossible to go to pretty much any corner of the internet without someone being like, safe space, oh, I'm going to wear my diaper and get my sad clothes on because I'm going to be in my safe space. And then I'm like, hey, do you know what safe spaces are? And they're like, well, it's a place where wimps go to cry. And I say, well, no, actually, they got their origin in the 1980s because Christian groups were sending Christians into LGBTQ support groups to tell people there who were sharing their stories about being gay or lesbian or trans or non-binary that they were going to burn in hell. And because they were in an LGBT group, there was nothing that could really stop that person from going in and just saying these terrible things. So they established something called a safe space, which was the idea that you could go into this space, you could say what you needed to say without judgment, without reserve, and that it was quite literally a safe space to say and do things that don't come with all the constructions of, a normal conversation. So for instance, you've got a homophobic dad, right, who's kicked you out of the house and you're in a safe space and you want to talk about how much you'd like to kill your dad, right? The confines of a safe space are built, and there's quite a bit of evidence to sort of back this up in the mental health community. They're built around a combination of venting, but also making it a safe place for like-minded people to express things that they cannot vent in the outside world. And having talked to internet trolls and self-named Nazis, when I've explained that, no one has ever said, I don't think that thing should exist. They've always said, yeah, but this person over here, the example they use is Goldsmiths. This was a couple of years ago, so probably not a lot of people remember this. A few years ago at Goldsmiths, Miriam Namazi was giving a talk on Islamism and the problems that she faced when she was growing up Muslim. And the Muslim Students Union interrupted her, unplugged her projector, were throwing things at her, and were yelling safe space at the same time. Now that is in no way a safe space, but they yelled the word safe space. So a lot of the time when I explain what a safe space is, people will go, yeah, but what about those guys who threw a projector at Miriam Namazi's head? And I'm like, hey, they could have yelled anything. They could have yelled, Kentucky's 5 for 5 deal and thrown it at them. And we wouldn't be like, well, the 5 for 5 deal is not great because those guys threw a projector at Namazi's head while they were saying it. And so, again, what I think my obligations are when it comes to being a social justice warrior aren't to make anyone feel bad, but to explain things, common terms that get people upset, that people think are silly or stupid or make no sense, to explain them in layman's terms so that people can understand them. And more importantly, help people understand that we really are on the same page when it comes to a lot of this. And that when you get past those bad actors or those people who misuse terms, you'll find that I think pretty much everyone, and not everyone, but pretty much everyone that I've had a reasonable conversation with goes, yeah, I guess I'm a social justice warrior too. They take on that label just as happily.
Well, let's parse that out a little bit, because I'm definitely not a social justice warrior, although I have nothing really against anything you've just said, obviously, right? I think that you're right. A reasonable person will take what you just said and happen to agree with it. But the reality is that these terms have been overused, hijacked, manipulated, and gone to forming a specific ideologue or agenda, especially from the intersectionality or feminist standpoint theory of things of that nature. So when you say things like safe space, for example, like I ride the bus a lot, and that's a safe space for runaway teenagers, right? It actually, I think, even says in there something like a safe space, or that means that that kid can go there knowing that if he's an abusive family or something like that, they're going to get him to the authorities. They're going to make sure that he's protected. And these groups, like you said, when you're putting yourself out there and you have something to say, you do not want other people throwing these invectives and pejoratives and these empty rhetoric things like, oh, you're going to burn in hell because you're a transsexual kind of thing. I get that, right? That is what I consider to be a valid, safe space. But I think what people mock is there are cry rooms. There are literally now on campuses rooms just set up so you can go have a good cry. I think people think that's like, and I do, that's taking what you're saying, the original type of safe space, and just taking it to an extreme. Or the safe space, like in the internet here, as you know, these are not safe spaces. Now, granted, there's some kind of moderation. If somebody was to come in here and start bagging on somebody because they have to be gay, I would fuck their world over, right? Because we don't tolerate that shit. That's not because it's a safe space. This is because we're not assholes. You know, so you have to be really careful, I think, and not you specifically, but people in general, when they hear these terms, what does somebody mean by it? If you're going to explain to me what a safe space is or a social justice warrior from your perspective, as you did, I got no issue with any of that. Really none. Right?
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a really valid pushback, right? Which is, who do we let define these terms? And you actually brought it up at the beginning in a way that I think is amazing, which is skeptic, right? I have not let the fact that when people hear skeptic, they might think I'm a vaccine crazy person or a 9/11 truther or a flat earther, right? These are people who have all taken a good label and twisted it and misappropriated it for their own use.
Absolutely.
Similarly, I don't let someone who abuses the term safe space for whatever reason, be it goldsmiths or some kid losing their mind. And I'm a college teacher. I teach at a university in New York, and like, my kids lose their minds all the time, right? They are 19. If you have ever taught a 19 or even interacted with a 19-year-old, if you've interacted with anyone under the age of 25, and they are going to lose their shit over nothing 7 times a day.
I would be going to jail at 19. My threshold's like 28 to 35 at this point in my life. I don't even take the chance of anybody under 21. If you can't have a beer, probably not going to be hanging out with you.
Right. And I'll point out, because you brought up college students, and this is sort of the metaphor I always use that I think helps people see this, because they'll say, well, what about what happened at this college? Or what about what these college students did? And the example I always give is, yes, that's bad behavior. I disagree with it. I don't let it define my terms, just like I don't let a vaccine skeptic define, the word skepticism for me. But similarly, if I went to Bob Jones University tomorrow, or if I went to BYU tomorrow, and I found some 19-year-old kid and just blasted their theism, we wouldn't be like, yeah, Eli, you win. We'd be like, why are you picking on a 19-year-old, man? So similarly, when it comes to social justice, if someone shows me a crying 18-year-old girl screaming at someone, I'm like, yeah, man, that's a kid. It's a baby.
But that's
go find me.
But that's the face of it.
So,
honestly, when people hear social justice warrior, the first thing that comes to my mind is idiots like Steve Shives, right? I mean, that's I think normal for most people when they hear these terms like social justice or this emo, unattractive female shouting about feminism on stuff she's never had any real experience in college. She's just out there promoting literally what she's been told to parrot by feminist standpoint theory, that somehow knowledge is somehow different between the sexes. Like literally science differs between a male and a female depending on how you're taught it, because male knowledge is different than female knowledge according to them. I think that's crap. Right.
But again, we wouldn't hold any other set of beliefs to that standard. And I think it speaks not to the set of ideas itself, but to what the societal construct has been around it, right? Just as we wouldn't say, what's that guy, Charlie Kirk, right? If I say, well, I find Charlie Kirk best epitomizes conservatism, right? Locke would rise from the grave and put me in a headlock and be like, that is not what I meant by the freedom of ideas, right? And yet, right, it would be unfair of me to say Charlie Kirk represents conservatism, just as it's unfair for me to say, a 17-year-old who doesn't know feminist, right? It's not even that she's taken a feminist studies class. She's thought about taking a feminist studies class, right? Because I've taken a ton of feminist studies, and when people are like, well, you explain intersectionality to me, I do, and 10 minutes later, they're like, oh, I believe that. Yeah, that makes sense, right? I don't think a lot of people reject intersectionality as an idea.
I do, sort of. And let me explain why. And let me explain why. And this was This was a fascinating discussion we had with, obviously, and you watched it, and most people are familiar with it when we had Carl Benjamin on with Brittany Simon. By the way, who's a wonderful human being. I got to hang out with her the other day. She is a wonderful human being in real life as she is on the internet. Surprising, I know.
She's very much in your camp, Eli. Very much.
Oh yeah, she's a feminist. Oh yeah, and it was, and we've had this almost a similar discussion because her and I think pretty much exactly alike a lot of things. We just have different terms for these things. I'm okay with that as long as I get her concepts and she gets mine. We can have a dialogue. I don't have to use the same terminology she uses, but. You know, we were talking about intersectionality. To me, it seems like this narrative of persecution versus privilege. And when people get together and they say, wait a minute, what group is mostly persecuted? What group has more privilege? I don't know if that's a really appropriate way to really have a dialogue about the actual issues we're having, because at that point, it's just people complaining about persecution porn. And I've seen that too often with other groups that they want to be victimized. They want to be marginalized because it gives them a platform. And I'm not saying that to you by any means, but that is what we see as outsiders when we look at the intersectionality movement, right?
Right, but there's a difference between the common understanding of intersectionality and what intersectionality actually is, right? So intersectionality...
And I'm willing to entertain that, yes. I'm willing to entertain that. I really did understand the distinction. Right.
So Grace Lee Boggs, who is a brilliant author, who I highly recommend, she talks a little bit high, but if you can make it through her stuff, get in there, have some fun with it. She really propagates the term intersectionality. It's got nothing to do with persecution. It's actually got nothing to do with who is more persecuted or less persecuted. And the example I give to, and I think we're all intersectional under this definition, the example I give to explain intersectionality, and this is the academic definition of it. Right now, look, I want to admit right now, because when I give these definitions, and before I give this definition, I always get the same response. People say, okay, but that's not how I hear intersectionality being used, right? When you hear intersectionality being used, it's someone on Twitter saying, how dare you, as a kitty cat, tell me that I can do this, that, or the other thing. And again, I'll just point out, and I know I'm a little bit of a broken record here, we do not let the worst actors of any other set of ideals define it. Right? We don't let, atheist dude 426 who tweets, kill the Jews, define all of atheism. Similarly, if someone is misusing the term intersectionality, which is an academic term defined by Grace Lee Boggs in her work, to mean where the crossover is in between different forms of social justice, something that I think we're all interested in and explore, it's our obligation as interlocutors, and more importantly, it's our obligation as educators to use those terms correctly, not to not correct that crazy person on Twitter, right? If that crazy person on Twitter, for instance, says, hey, I'm Jewish, so I'll use Jewish stuff as an example because I don't want to upset anybody. But, if there's a Jewish person on Twitter who says, you can't discuss the Holocaust because you're not Jewish, right? Which is how you hear intersectionality being misapplied on a pretty regular basis. Or, you can't talk about anti-Semitism because you're not Jewish. Not only is that not intersectionality, it's the opposite of intersectionality, because as Boggs describes intersectionality, it is, what is your social justice for? And to what does your social justice apply to? And the example I use all the time is my atheism does not exist in a vacuum. My atheism is specifically based on the creeping problems that theocracy creates, not the personal beliefs of individuals, and not even the underlying ideas of those beliefs, although I'm certainly interested in those topics. It is, what does theocracy do? How does it affect women? How does it affect gay people? How does it affect trans people in this country? That is Boggs's definition of intersectionality. It is how one element of social justice, in my case, the fight against theocracy, interacts with other elements of social justice, racism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And again, while it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying the majority of the time I hear these ideas being used, they're being abused, it is our obligation as interlocutors and as educators to correctly use those definitions, no matter how badly the people use them, right? Just as we won't let Matt Powell define atheism as wanting to fuck kids and deserving to die, right? Now, let's be fair. The definition most commonly used of atheism is believing in God but hating him, or in your heart that God is right. I mean, the things that are all on the Twitter timeline. Right, exactly.
You're just another theist denying his belief in God. That's all.
Right, exactly. That is the commonly used.
Don't start channeling Satan.
That's the commonly used definition of atheism, but we see it as our obligation as educators to use it correctly and to deal with the arguments that are made against the ideas as we mean them, not the ideas as they're being strawmanned by our opponents.
Yeah, but those are usually the loudest voices.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
When you look at